Welcome back to Proxy, everybody, and today we're going to be talking about Craftworld Eldar Rangers in 10th edition and how to use them. So I've decided to do a new series. We're going to be talking about Outcast and Corsair units in the next few videos on this channel. And I actually think these units are superb, and we're going to go over them over the next couple days. We're going to cover Shroud Runners, Corsair Void Reavers, and of course, Corsair Void Scarred. Each have their own role in an Eldar army, and each are very strong units, if a little bit expensive for the Corsair Void Scarred, that is. So without further ado, let us go ahead and jump right into it and talk about Rangers in 10th edition. But first, a quick overview of what we're going to be looking at today. In this video, we're going to be looking at the stats, weapons, and special rules of Rangers, their strengths and weaknesses, their combos and synergies, and the role Rangers play in an Eldar army, and how to make the most out of them. So looking at their stats, Rangers are movement 7 like most Eldar infantry. They have a 5+ save, which is kind of low for Eldar units. It's even lower than Guardians, but they have a 5++ or 5+ invulnerable save versus shooting. Now, keep in mind, it is only versus shooting. I know it says invul 5+ right there, but if you actually click on it and read the text under it, it will say that it's only against shooting. So you do have to be aware of that. As for their weapons, they're all armed with Ranger long rifles and shuriken pistols. The Ranger long rifle has strength 4, AP -1, and damage 2. This is actually slightly worse than the Apparel versions, which have AP 2, which kind of sucks, but these guys are very cheap as a result. It may be an index mistake, or quite simply, it may just be designed this way because Rangers are a little bit cheaper, right? I know Imperial snipers are, also very cheap, but, Rangers are quite cheap for Eldar, that is. So it also does have the heavy keyword and precision keywords, meaning they can target characters within units, and they get +1 to hit when standing still. They will mostly be on the move, just keep that in mind, but there will be times where they'll stand still and they'll be able to hit on a 2+. They're also armed with shuriken pistols, which may at first seem pretty useless, but in some situations you might actually prefer to shoot the pistol over the rifle. So against 1 wound light infantry, they actually hit better than the Ranger long rifle. So if you're moving and shooting, they hit a little bit better. And the pistols also have assault. So if you need to advance to get somewhere and you still want to shoot something, you can always shoot the pistols, which isn't bad. They're also armed with basic close combat weapons. This is nothing to write home about. They have 1 attack each. They're not doing any damage in close combat, and in fact, they're worse than regular aspect warriors like fire dragons in that, at least aspect warriors get a couple of attacks each, and these guys only get 1. They really don't want to be in close combat. As for their abilities, they have the Infiltrators and Stealth rule. So Infiltrators allows them to deploy outside of the deployment zone when they're deploying, as long as they're outside of 9 inches of enemy units. This helps them get into better positions on the board. They have the Stealth rule, which means they're at -1 to hit. They can also move D6 inches when an enemy ends a move within 9 inches. So it's kind of like that Tyranid Termagon ability. I think it's called Primal Instincts or something like that. But basically, they move D6 when an enemy moves within 9. This is very good against charges, so it makes them very assault resistant, but it doesn't do so much versus shooting. Keep in mind that if your opponent still wants to rapid fire, they could easily just be within 12 inches, not be within 9 inches, and never proc the Path of the Outcast ability. So you do have to watch out for that. It's not going to protect you versus shooting, but it is useful against charges, and basically makes them impossible to charge unless your enemy is really close. They can be taken in units of 5 or 10 as well, and they're very cheap at 55 points for 5 and 110 points for 10. They're actually the cheapest unit in the Eldar Index, so you can take these guys for very cheap, and you can use them for secondary objectives and, just basic utility, which makes them a very powerful tool in an Eldar army. And of course, they also have the infantry keyword, so they can move through terrain without any penalty. So what are the Rangers' strengths and weaknesses? So their strengths are that they can infiltrate to lock down areas of the board. This is actually a very powerful ability. You typically want something in your army with the ability to infiltrate so that you can kind of mess with your opponent's deployment. You can block off enemy infiltrators and block off other units from getting to certain places in the board. Their precision weapons are decent against supporting characters. So even though they're not great against heavier characters, they're not going to be taking down a Primaris Lieutenant or anything like that, but they are pretty good at taking out things like opposing Spirit Seers, for example. stuff with low toughness, low amount of wounds, and is there to support a much tougher unit that it's joined to. And there are a lot of units in 40k and a lot of supporting models that basically do this, right? Necrons have the Cryptek, Chaos have the Dark Apostle or Dark Apothecary, whatever it's called, which is a very nasty supporting model that leads cultists. And yeah, not the toughest model out there, but in a squad of cultists, it can be very hard to take out. So precision weapons can get around that. They're great at screening and objective play. They're really good at scoring secondary objectives because of their infiltrate, and because they're cheap, you're not really losing much of their shooting if you want to deploy teleport homers or stuff like this. Deploy teleport homers is probably the best thing that these guys can do and behind enemy lines. If your opponent gives you the chance to, you can actually use infiltrate to get close to enemy lines, move into your enemy's deployment zone, and then just score away. There's been more than one occasion in my games where Rangers have made up their points value just in the amount of secondaries they've been able to score on. They're also very difficult for enemies to engage in combat. So this is another nice little trick, is that enemies want to engage these guys in close combat because they're semi-resistant to shooting. Yes, shooting takes them out fairly easily, but they do have a 5+ invul save, and they're much worse in combat. So they're an ideal target for things like Assault Marines, right? Squad of 5 Assault Marines definitely wants to take these guys out. Squad of 5 Assault Marines is not going to be charging into Wraith Guard. It's not going to be charging into a Wraith Lord or anything like that. Probably not going to want to charge into a vehicle either, just because of the fact that vehicles are so tough and, you know, the Assault Marines will never be able to kill it. If they get within 18 inches of Dire Avengers, they're going to get Overwatch to death. So, you know, what's the ideal target here? Well, it's either Guardians or Rangers, right? So a lot of times they're going to want to engage with those types of units because they will beat them down in combat, and Rangers can simply just move D6 out and get the hell out, right? So this makes them very difficult to engage in close combat with, which is a good thing. Their weaknesses, however, are they're very squishy. If anybody fires bolters at these guys, enough bolters will bring them down, you know, and I'm not talking about 5 bolter shots. 5 bolter shots is not going to kill them. 10 bolter shots probably won't kill them. But 20 bolter shots, and these guys are goners. They also have pretty low damage, so they're not a unit you take for its damage. Their weapons really only have 1 shot apiece, and their real strength lies in the damage they can do to characters and not to other units in your opponent's army. So yeah, there's ways you can make them, you know, a bigger unit, and you can put buffs on them and stuff, but even so, it's just not really going to be worth it to take these guys if you want to do a lot of damage. These guys are primarily an objective and utility-based unit. So what are their combos and synergies? What do Rangers work well with? So Rangers, unsurprisingly, work really well with Illic Nightspear. He essentially gives them the lone operative ability so they can't be targeted by anything outside of 12 inches, and rerolls to wound. You combine that with things like Phantasm, and you have a very difficult unit to deal with. Again, Eldar have access to some really good movement shenanigans. I know Space Marine Scouts have the lone operative ability as well on their Sniper Scouts, which is a great ability, but they don't have the ability to, you know, retroactively move in your opponent's turn. So not only can Rangers move when you get within 9 inches, but you can easily just Phantasm. If your opponent gets within 12 to try to rapid fire you, but outside of 9 inches, you could just use Phantasm and move your unit back out of range. So your opponent then loses their chance to shoot you. And will have to pick a new target, which sometimes won't always be an option, depending on how the rest of your forces are set up. The Night Spinner can slow down enemy units further, making it harder for enemies to close the distance to them. Again, if there's a fast-moving unit that you know can advance and shoot, like a bike squad or something like that that has assault weapons in it, and your Rangers are going to be toasted by that squad, a Night Spinner can go a long way to preventing that. You know, bikes are very fast, so being able to slow down that movement and prevent them from advancing can be an absolute godsend. And I actually have a pretty good idea for an Outcast-based list that uses the Night Spinner, uses D weapons and Rangers to basically control the board and make it really hard for your opponent to move around. I'm going to try out this list this week, and I'm going to post it at the end of this video. Hopefully the list doesn't just bomb horribly so that I can actually show you a semi-successful list, but we'll see. It's kind of based on my LA Talk list of last edition, so we'll just have to hold our breath on that one. But the theory is sound, so hopefully it works out. The Viper is also very good because it can strip cover from enemies, helping the Rangers get more precision damage through. So most characters are just going to be in cover. It's just that simple. You know, most units in the game are going to get the benefit of cover. So having something that can strip that away can help the Rangers do more damage against those targets within their units. So what is the role of Rangers in an Eldar army, and how do you make the most out of them? So this is a question a lot of players ask, because Rangers are one of those units that when you look at them, just on paper, they don't look that good to a new player, right? A new player might enter the game and see them and think they're really cool, and then look at the rules and see their damage and just be like, it's not that great, right? So what Rangers are is they're not a damaging unit. You don't take them for damage. And in past editions, like I would never take these guys in something like a 5th edition list, unless I was just having fun, because in 5th edition, they didn't do any damage and they didn't really serve any good purpose, right? However, what Rangers are nowadays is they're a versatile utility unit that can run movement interference on enemy units, secure objectives, or provide light-ranged character elimination. So what they are is they're a toolbox, right? And I know you guys have probably heard that term before, toolbox, but it's never really truly been explained in the context of 40K. So basically what a toolbox means is that they can perform multiple roles in a battle depending on what you need. So it's just like you're working in the garage, right? And you're trying to fix something and you notice you need a hammer or you need a screwdriver to, loosen a screw or something like that. Whatever you need, your toolbox or multi-tool can provide, right? And that's kind of basically what this means. So this means that there's going to be a lot of games where one or more of the things that your Rangers do is not going to be that useful. So some people's armies aren't going to have a lot of light supporting characters, and their light character assassination isn't going to be useful to you, right? There's going to be some armies that movement interference won't work. So there's going to be armies that fly. Dark Eldar are a great example of this. All their models fly, so you can't really block their movement too much. So that won't be an option for you in that game. So their role might change slightly depending on what your opponent's composition is and so forth. Their low cost also makes them very expendable. So they're one of those units that doesn't pay a premium price for having a lot of different things that they can do on the battlefield. And one of the best ways you can use them is to bait enemy units out into the open. So securing objectives early is a really good way of basically forcing your opponent to react to your movements. Your opponent is not going to just let you take objectives unless they're just a really novice player, right? They're going to want to fight you for those objectives. So putting a cheap unit on an objective early can force more expensive units to come out. So I like to call this the trading tactic, right? You put Rangers onto an objective, Rangers cost 55 points, but to be able to kill that Ranger unit, your opponent is going to have to use more than 55 points worth of stuff. I really don't think there's any 55-point unit in the game that can actually kill Rangers in one round of shooting. So what that means is your opponent is going to have to put maybe 100 points worth into killing those Rangers. And maybe more, actually, depending on the army. So what that means is those units are going to move out into the open or out into a place where you can see them, and then next turn you can shoot them and trade up. You trade your 55-point unit of Rangers for a 100-point unit of Space Marines or a 100-point unit of Tau Fire Warriors, etc. And at that point, you're ahead. And because we're Eldar, we can get our own units back to safety by using Phantasm and using things like Fire and Fade. So even though we may have exposed more than 100 points to kill those Fire Warriors, we can easily move those units back out of line of sight. So we can very easily out-trade a lot of armies playing that game. And when Rangers are with Illic, they become a very difficult unit to pin down and really do solid damage. So not only can they not be targeted outside 12 inches, but they basically become impossible to target. Especially with things like Phantasm, Rangers are just going to be a consistent thorn in your enemy's side, and your opponent will really be cursing them. The only real downside to this is it's very expensive. It basically turns the Rangers into a more expensive unit that needs to deal damage to make its points value back. So yes, they get to reroll wounds. I think that's why GW gave Illic that ability, which is helpful against characters, but if your opponent doesn't have that many characters in their army, it might still not be that great, especially if you can't get line of sight to those characters. And just remember that true line of sight still exists. So if you can't see the enemy character, you can't shoot at it. and you'll just have to shoot at the unit instead. And this can severely hamper the value of that unit. So, Illic Night Spear and 10 Rangers is a very scary proposition for an anti-character unit. Your opponent will know this and will hide their characters accordingly. So do be careful about that. And definitely keep it in mind. So you're going to want a really good position on the battlefield with these guys to make them worthwhile. Okay, so then here comes the question, right? The biggest question about using Rangers. If Rangers are so versatile, how do I know what to do with them in each game? Because that's a common question newer players will have, or even more experienced players will have, right? Is, I have this unit of Rangers, but I don't know if I'm using them in the correct way. I know that they're good. I see people using them all the time effectively. I just don't know how to use them effectively myself. So to use them well, you need to ask the following questions. Does my opponent rely on really squishy support characters to buff up big units? If so, then using them as a character elimination unit will be very effective for their points cost. So if your opponent is another Eldar player or a Chaos Space Marines player, basically any player with squishy supporting characters joining units to make them stronger, Rangers can be used to kill those supporting characters and make it easier for your army to deal with those units. So nothing's worse as an Eldar player than going against another Eldar player and realizing that you're going to have to deal with that 10-man Wraith Guard squad in some way, right? And unless you're one of those players running 2 Wraith Knights and running a bunch of, D-weapon spam, it's going to be pretty hard to take down that Wraith Guard unit without some support or without the ability to take out that Spirit Seer. So Rangers can basically fulfill this role for you in those games. And even if your opponent has the Phoenix Gem, right? Which they might. They might take the Phoenix Gem with their Spirit Seer. Even if they get that revive, over the course of a couple turns, a couple Ranger units can easily kill a Spirit Seer. And no questions asked. Spirit Seers are very squishy. They're toughness 3. They only have 3 wounds and a 4+ invul. They're either going to be wasting fate dice trying to keep them alive desperately, or they're just going to be hiding the Spirit Seer, behind some ruins. And in that case, the Wraith Guard are not going to be in the greatest of positions. So do keep that in mind. That is a very effective tactic for dealing with those types of units. The next question you should ask yourself is, does my opponent have a very fast army that will outmaneuver me and control the pace of the game? If so, then use them as a screening unit. So a lot of bike-oriented armies have a whole lot of speed, good shooting, and good combat ability in relation to your units. Remember, in an Eldar army, most of your units are going to be shooters, and if they don't get the first strike, they're going to go down, even if they are a combat unit. So bikes can be a very good way of beating an Eldar player just because they're very fast and they have really strong hard-hitting abilities. Especially orc bikes, by the way. I know people think orcs aren't the greatest faction, but despite what their tournament win rate would suggest, orcs are actually a pretty tough proposition if you don't know how to fight against them. One of these things being that orc speed bikes, or speed freaks, or whatever they're called, are extremely fast and will outmaneuver you easily while providing good shooting ability and also great combat ability. Remember, the wall allows them to advance, move, and charge, all in one turn, while also gaining a 5+ invulnerable save. So, if you have units that are out of position, you're going to get caught very easily. Rangers can prevent this by screening out your units and making sure that those orcs are only going to, at most, kill 55 points worth of models in that turn. Because they're just not going to be able to move past your Rangers if you screen properly. So, in reality, in real life, would Rangers be able to block a squad of speed bikes or slow them down? No, they would just get run over. Right? But in game terms, you can't move past other models unless you have the fly keyword. So you can definitely set up your Rangers in front of the speed bikes and say, okay, well, you got to go around them, and orcs will lose movement. And because they'll lose movement, they won't be able to get to the targets they want to get to that turn. So the next question you should ask yourself is, does my opponent have other infiltrators? If so, then use your Rangers to prevent your opponent from deploying their infiltrators in key positions. What you don't want to do is you don't want to allow your opponent to get free objectives in no man's land if you can help it. So if you have a squad of Rangers, you can at least deny one of those objectives to your opponent. So there's usually about 2 objectives in the middle of the board. And if your opponent has infiltrators, you're going to want to at least prevent your opponent from getting to both of those objectives. So deploying a unit of rangers right on an objective from the beginning of the game is a good way to secure that area of the board for yourself. And it synergizes really well with units like Dire Avengers who want to control objectives in the midboard so they can use their 4+ Overwatch. So that is a very good strategy and setup you can use as well to make the most out of your Dire Avengers in later turns. Lastly, does your opponent favor one side of the board over the other? Does your opponent have a really strong elite army that wants to dominate one side of the board really effectively? An army like Custodes, which are very elite and very powerful, but maybe don't have the model count to control the entire board, right? And typically Custode armies are really small, so they really don't have the ability to control the entire board and just flood the board with models. So if that's the case, then you can use Rangers to sneak into your opponent's deployment zone and score objectives on the side of the board that they don't have models in. Eldar really do have the speed and maneuverability to eliminate isolated targets, so if your opponent is not a novice playing a Custode army or another very elite army, they're probably not going to just put one unit on one side of the board and the rest of their army on the other, unless they just want that unit to die, right? They're going to want to have them close so they can support their units properly. So using a unit of Rangers to just throw on one side of the battlefield, sneak into an enemy deployment zone, and just score on objectives is a really solid way to get a lot of use out of them. And if they can score secondary objective points throughout the battle, they've already made up their points worth in spades. Behind enemy lines and deploy teleport homers is just a great secondary combo, and Rangers can do this very easily if they're given the chance to. So do look out for those opportunities when they present themselves. Okay, so in conclusion, Rangers are an extremely useful unit that can perform a variety of support tasks depending on your opponent's playstyle, deployment, and army composition. So these guys require a little bit of thought, they require a little bit of knowledge of what your opponent has and how your opponent is going to use their forces in battle. But once you do consider that, the versatility of Rangers means they will never not have an important role to perform in a game. They're never going to be useless in a game, right? And I know for some lists, certain units might feel useless, right? Like a good example would be like if you took a squad of Howling Banshees and your opponent was an Imperial Knight player. Yeah, those Howling Banshees are going to feel really useless in that game. They're probably not going to do anything, right? However, units like Rangers, even in bad matchups where they're not going to do any damage, are still good because they are a utility unit and they will support your army in different ways and allow you to score on secondary objectives. So they're always going to have a valuable role in any game you play, which means they're always going to be a solid pick. With Illic, you add another layer to the Rangers. They're another beast entirely if you take Illic, because now they're almost completely immune to attacks and they're doing significantly more damage against characters and also just other units as well. And you very well could run them this way. Now, I will give you guys one word of warning though, as far as Illic and his Rangers. I have tried them out. They are cool. They are good. One problem with them is line of sight. Because they're Rangers, they don't want to be really close to enemy units. They're probably going to want to be somewhere in the backfield, probably just outside your deployment zone in some ruins. And because of this, getting line of sight on key enemy characters will sometimes be difficult, especially if your opponent knows what they're doing. In one game, I had an opponent that had a Chaos Rhino literally parked right in front of Abaddon because I had this unit. I could never see Abaddon that entire game because that Rhino was just sitting in the way. And because my opponent had a lot of other heavy threats on the battlefield that were taking the attention of my Bright Lances and Fire Dragons and things like that, I really didn't have much in the way to kill that Rhino. So that Rhino was just sitting there, kind of hard to kill, obscured, so would have gotten a cover save and stuff like that. And Abaddon was pretty much safe from Illic Nightspear and his unit of Rangers. And I actually just had to pretty much ignore that big unit of Terminators for the entire game. So even though in theory Illic should have been very effective at killing Abaddon, killing the support characters in that Terminator unit so that it would be easier to tackle and take on, they just couldn't do it because they didn't have line of sight. So that may be something you have to watch out for with that unit, and you have to deploy them very well and very precisely to get the most out of them. It's a great unit if you can get the positioning right, but if you can't get the positioning right, it can be a little bit hard to use them. And, it just depends on how your boards look too. We've been playing with a slightly different board with more obscuring terrain this edition, kind of like what GW gave as an example. So if you guys are using terrain setups that are similar to that example, you might have a little bit of trouble using this unit just because it's very easy for an opponent to just hide a character behind obscuring terrain, and there's really nothing you can do about it, right? So that is a challenge you have to overcome if you want to run Illic. You're going to have to keep that in mind and get a good position for your unit. All right, everybody, that is going to be it for today. Thanks for watching. Thank you to all my patrons and supporters who have supported the channel over the last months. Your help is greatly appreciated. And if you want to join my Patreon, you can. I have free trials set up, so there's no cost to you, and it gives you permanent access to our Discord community, which is a community of Eldar players that like to talk about strategy, tactics, and of course, hobbying. And I would definitely love to have more people join the Discord so we can have some more opinions in there and different thoughts and ideas. And it's no cost to you. You do have to sign up for a free trial, but other than that, it's totally free. So keep that in mind and think about joining our community. It's really cool. Also, if you do want to grab some Eldar-inspired apparel, check out my store page. I have a bunch of different Eldar-inspired apparel in there, from Aspect Warriors to, Guardians and other funny stuff. So go check that out when you get the chance, and you can rep your favorite faction in your local game store. All right, everybody, that's going to be it for today. Peace out. See you guys next time. Tomorrow, we're going to talk about Shroud Runners, so stay tuned for that video. Have a good one, everybody. See you later.